Good morning and good afternoon. This is David Willis from Center for the Study of Social Policy, and you joined us for our Frameworks Institute report release, talking about building relationships, framing early relational health. We're thrilled that all of you are joining us. We've had an amazing interest. Over 1,000 people have registered, and we're thrilled that you have strong interest in this effort. Just as a few first starts, all of you are muted so that you actually will not be able to verbally ask questions, but the chat function should be open, and we welcome comments and we welcome questions, of course, as the webinar moves forward. This is very exciting for us today. The agenda you all have seen, but I wanted to give you a few introductory remarks. First of all, early relational health is really an emergent term that has really galvanized the interest of many stakeholders and leaders in child and public health sectors, drawing attention to the essential early relational experiences that contribute greatly to infant and toddler development and overall child and family well-being. The champions of the term early relational health believe that there is really an urgent need and an immediate opportunity to expand the health system's role in providing universal promotion, prevention, and early intervention activities that strengthen these relationships for infants, toddlers, and their families in order to address the rising population challenges of social, emotional, and educational delays, behavioral problems, future mental health issues, and certainly now with this period of the COVID epidemic. But early relational health is, although a new term for some of you, does not designate a new field, nor a new series of discoveries. In fact, early relational health builds upon decades of research from the fields of child development, infant mental health, and neurodevelopment that establish the centrality of relationships between caregivers and very young children for future health, development, and social emotional well-being. Today, we're very interested in bringing to you some of the findings of our work of this last year. By the generous support of the Perigee Fund, we worked over the last year at CSSP to advance early relational health in child health and community. The goal of our work was to accelerate the framing, understanding, and application of early relational health principles and practices among stakeholders and networks in pediatrics, mental health, family support, early childhood systems building, as well as with parents. Our first year of work has been focused on establishing definition and framing of some of the core principles of relational health that could be useful for the fields of pediatrics, child health, and communities. We've been very intentional to engage prominent stakeholder networks in this work, testing some of the strengths of these ideas. We've had a national early relational health advisory panel. We have engaged with partners in the field, including Reach Out and Read, Healthy Steps, Promoting First Relationships, our EC Link communities, and others. We've conducted a national survey that I'll touch note in just a moment, and we've worked to develop an action plan to continue this work moving forward. As many of you may have participated in our national survey that had over near 600 people that responded across the sectors. Many of you may have been a part of that in terms of trying to explore what do we know about current early relational health activities, best practices, policy needs, and interests across all the sectors and systems. One example of the finding was that we had from the working definition of early relational health describing positive, stimulating, and nurturing early relationships to ensure emotional security and connections to advance health, development, social well-being, and resiliency. Over 500 people responded to a sense that not being knowledgeable about how do you feel about this concept of early relational health, over 65% of people that responded felt very knowledgeable of that concept or knowledgeable in a sense. So there's an awareness of this. Secondly, the survey also noted about how important early relational health is understood to be toward promoting healthy development and to long-term health. So this space and this understanding is really interesting. And from our national survey, it was clear. We learned that there is strong, broad, and building interest in early relational health as evidenced by all of you that have come to our webinar. Many stakeholders are eager to identify how do we translate these concepts into action, policies, and activities. There's a clear recognition that we need to be thinking about policy and financing strategies that promote all of this kind of work. And of course, the term early relational health, we must be very careful about defining what that means and the framing of these kind of conversations. And we learned very early in this work that the voice of families and family leadership is really critical to understanding the strength-based efforts of supporting families, not about finding problems or another reason in which they may fail, but rather about partnering with families in the way of promoting their strengths and capacities over time. But it was in this awareness that we really need to think about how do we most importantly message about this work, that Perigee likewise supported the importance of exploring the understanding of communication. We know that the understanding of relational health requires that there is a strong understanding of the frames that make it well understood. And there's no better organization that we could have gone to than the Frameworks Institute to really help us explore, research, and learn about how does the concept of relational health, how is it understood, what are the frames within it, to really help strengthen our communication with professionals, parents, and the publics about our new commitment and our new focus on this relational context. So it's with great pleasure that I want to turn the next phase of our webinar to Maura O'Neill and to Dan Bussey, both of who are with Frameworks. Maura O'Neill is a senior researcher and director of interpretation at Frameworks Institute. There she works with the interdisciplinary teams, employing a range of research methods to further understand a public understanding of social issues. She is trained as a sociologist, earned her master's and doctoral degrees from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Dan Bussey is also a psychologist and a director of research at Frameworks. His past research and was focused on cross-disciplinary approaches to understand social determinants of mental health and illness in children and youth. He's focused on emotional and cognitive neurobiological mechanisms, understanding the association between child maltreatment and child and adolescent mental health disorders. He has a BS in psychology from the University of Bath in England and a master's and doctoral degrees in human development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So let me turn this now to Maura and to Dan, please.
Hi, David, if you can stop sharing.
I can, yeah.
Thank you.
Whoops, sorry. Stop sharing. Where is the stop sharing element?
It's at the bottom toolbar.
There we go.
Okay, and I will start to share. All right, we're in good shape, a relatively smooth technological transfer. So that's always a good sign. I want to start by giving a number of thank yous. First, I want to thank the CSSP and particularly David and Amy, who have just been incredible partners as we, in all phases of this research. And I also want to thank the generosity of the Perigee Foundation for supporting this research. Now, before I get to my final thank you, I want to show you a little reframe that has been going around the internet. So one way to talk about what we're all experiencing for those of us who really do have the privilege to be working from home right now is we are working from home during this crisis, or we could say we are at home during this crisis trying to work. And so with that reframe, I'm going to offer a couple of advance apologies. So if you hear blood-curdling screams in the background, congratulations, you have front row tickets to my daughter's daily fight. I'm thinking about starting to charge admission. And again, I will apologize for any internet issues. We have lots of people trying to do lots of things right now. And so that brings me to my final thank you, which is to all of you who are on this webinar. So I am a parent, and all of you in some ways are talking to parents right now about the importance of relationships. Like many parents, I feel like I'm absolutely failing at homeschooling. But when I hear about the importance of relationships, it brings me comfort, and it makes me think for a second, maybe I'm doing things okay. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I'm joined with my colleague Dan, as David mentioned, who you'll be hearing from in a minute. We just hope that something that we say in this webinar can help you advance that work even further. Okay, so this is our plan for our time that we're going to talk. First, I'm going to talk to you about why framing matters, and to do that, I'm going to talk about other projects. I'll do that very quickly, but sort of 2 reasons why we think framing and framing together as a movement matters. And then I'm going to turn it to Dan, who's going to talk about some specific findings from this research. Now, we're not going to cover everything. We're just going to give you some highlights, but David will be talking to you where you can find the report at the end. Okay, so when I say framing, it's a simple definition, but it's quite important. It really means every choice that you make when you're out in the world communicating with people. So your tone of voice, what you emphasize, importantly, what you leave out. And the reason that is so important, because we know we have frameworks, lots and lots of scholars in the social and cognitive sciences know that those choices, big and small, can have measurable impacts on what people think about your message, what they do with that message, how they feel about your message. So I want to show you just one example of this in practice. So the one thing that we say all the time is understanding is frame dependent. It's not just what you say, that's really important, the what, but also how you say it. So here's the example. This is some research that we did with the Parenting Resource Center. It's a group in Australia that's doing research and service provision to help better support parents in Australia. And they're trying to get wide-scale public support for parenting programs, things that will help parents parent in the way that they want to. But they were experiencing a lot of communications challenges. So one part of that research is we tested 2 different frames for how to talk to the public about parenting and parenting supports for parents. So one message was, we really need to get behind these programs because we need more effective parenting. Now, you all out there can probably guess that 1, this is going to backfire, and 2, why it might backfire. Or another message that we tested was we need to better support parents because it's really important for child development. And here is what we found. The black line that you see across your screen is the control group. And so we're measuring everybody's responses and their expressions of support for parenting programs, and especially the use of public resources for these programs. And again, as you can see, the child development frame was really much more effective. Effective parenting did a number of things. It made people think, well, if you're a parent, you're either good or bad. That's an intrinsic quality. And we're going to get to that theme, that sort of way of thinking in a bit. And so there's nothing we can do to quote unquote improve parenting. Or there was a real sense of defensiveness, that you're coming to me telling me that what I'm doing is ineffective. So that was a frame that they were sort of leaning on, but we can see, and you can use research to see why that was effective. And again, it's not a huge shift in emphasis, but an important shift in emphasis to get greater support for those kinds of programs. So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, and these things are measurable. The other reason that we think framing is so important is because we know that frames are not the only, but a really important factor in large-scale movements for any kind of social change. So my disciplinary background, sociology, we spend a lot of time thinking through, why do some movements succeed? Why do some movements fail? And sort of across the board, one factor, again, not the only factor, but one factor is the framing decisions of that group or that movement. So I want to talk to you about an example of how we've seen this in practice on another project we're working that is dealing with the another end of the life course, and that's some work we're doing on reframing aging. So in this project, what our research showed and what lots of people across the country are sort of organizing around is to stop people thinking about the process of aging as a process of inevitable decline, dependency, and to talk about aging is a process that we're all undergoing. It's not just them over there, and it's a process of moving forward. And especially it can be a process of moving forward if we have the systems, policies, structures in place to better support older people. And we also wanted to help these activists, advocates, experts to bring greater attention to the issue of ageism, which is especially important right now. And instead of talking about how we need to have sympathy for older people, but we talk about ageism as a matter of justice, as something that we will not stand to see happen in this country because it's not right and it's not fair. And one really just remarkable impact of that work, of people really trying to talk in different ways about the process of aging and bring attention to ageism, might be one of the proudest things I've been a part of at Frameworks, is that they've gotten a number of fashion magazines and pharmacies, drugstores, to no longer carry any products or advertisements with the word anti-aging on them. And so especially for women, we get just a second of a break from thinking about this normal part of human development is something that we have to resist, fight, and battle. So that's what framing can do. You can make those shifts, which can have incredible impacts on people's everyday life. Something as simple as walking into CVS and buying the things that you need. So we're gonna start to talk about how we can effectively frame early relational health, some of the strategies that we found to be effective in our research. I'm gonna talk really briefly about the evidence base. And we're happy to take questions later or offline, but I wanna get to the good stuff, to the news of this webinar. So the first thing we did is what we call expert interviews. So we interviewed a number of people with specific a research background, expertise in early relational health. And with those interviews, Dan does have substantive expertise in this area, but I don't. And we would never presume to figure out by ourselves what is it that needs to be communicated to the public about early relational health. So we interviewed people and got to those core pieces of information that experts think that people, again, who don't have the privilege of being a part of the conversations like these, who don't have access to the information, what do they need to know about early relational health? We then conducted a number of peer discourse sessions or focus groups with 3 groups of people, with parents of young children, with early childhood educators, and with pediatricians, to start to test various framing strategies to effectively frame early relational health. And then we are drawing on a pretty significant body of research that we have at Frameworks on many issues related to early childhood development. So infant and child mental health. We recently completed a big project about developmental relationships, family, school, and community engagement. So lots of research that can give us some insights about how we best frame early relational health. And so the good news that we found is that people understand that relationships matter. It is the sort of a fundamental human experience. But what we found where they needed more support, more information is in 4 additional questions. When do they matter? Why do they matter? How do they matter? And really importantly, what can we do collectively as a society to make sure that they matter? So I am going to turn this over to Dan, who will take you through each of these 4 questions and some framing guidance that we learned from our research. So over to you, Dan.
Okay, thanks, Maura. Hopefully you can hear me. So you've heard a little bit already about what framing is and why it matters. So what I'm going to do is walk you through some of the recommendations that emerge from this research, as well as being informed by the broader set of work that Frameworks has conducted, as Maura just mentioned, over the past couple of decades on early childhood and related issues. So the first recommendation is that it's really important to orient people's thinking to when relationships matter, especially the role of relationships in those very earliest years of life. So use every available opportunity you have in text, in images, and the types of examples that you provide to tether that conversation really specifically to that particular time period. So why is this important? So in our work, we identify shared and patterned ways of thinking, we call mental models or cultural models, that can impede productive understanding of an issue, in this case, early relational health. And so what we found in this, and also in our prior research, is this common tendency for people to respond to questions about young children with responses that are clearly relevant to older children, and we call this aging up. So the way this looks like in practice is that you're asking a group about infants and toddlers, and suddenly people are talking about schools and social media and peer groups. And you know through those topics that people have clearly slipped into thinking about much older children. And this happens quite consistently. And so one of the reasons for this is that people understand what's happening developmentally much better for older kids than they do younger kids. And so it's much more comfortable for them to operate in that space, and much more difficult to get them anchored to that early childhood period. So what to do? So what we're recommending is to be really intentional about training people's attention to that critical period between birth and 3. And I'm going to give you a few strategies to do that. So the first is to provide really specific reference ages or age ranges in your messages and make sure you include those cues early on. So our research shows that when messages define early as a specific age or age range, conversations are much more likely to stay anchored on that early childhood period, rather than drift toward a discussion of older children. The other thing that you can do is mention behaviors or activities that signal those early childhood years more concretely. So, for example, you can use stories about children that involve learning to sit up or crawl or walk, or stories about pre-verbal children in a way that really sets people's thinking to that birth to 3 period. And last, communicators can really drive home this point by using images and videos of young children and their caregivers. Framing doesn't just have to be accomplished through text. You can also think about other types of media being effective frames, and advocates should feel really comfortable using images and video as another cue to orient people's thinking more specifically to early childhood. Okay, so next, to answer the question, why do relationships matter? Use the term foundational relationships to really communicate that early relational health is central to future development and well-being. So in peer discourse sessions in our focus groups, we found that the term foundational relationships specifically sparked some really productive conversations and dialogue about the ways in which relationships early in life set the stage for individuals' long-term outcomes and success. And that supporting relationships specifically within that period can have these cascading effects throughout the life course. And the reason why stressing this foundational nature of relationships is quite so important is that the public really don't have a very coherent and consistent understanding of how early development actually happens. We call this a kind of a black box. So because people tend to think about babies and infants as just needing to be fed and watered and have their diaper changed, they do tend to discount or dismiss some of the other kinds of needs that young children have. So the need to have meaningful relationships being one of them. They assume that relationships don't really come online meaningfully until much later in a child's life or matter for an individual's long-term success. And so one of the strategies, or a couple of strategies really to kind of get people thinking about this foundational nature of relationships is to use that foundational relationships metaphor. And in our focus groups, people use that metaphor of a foundation in really flexible and generative ways. And we would encourage members of the field who are communicating about this topic to feel similarly that they could use it in a variety of different ways. So for example, they could speak about the building blocks of positive outcomes. They could speak about the need for strong and stable relationships. They can speak about the stability that results from children's early positive relationships with caregivers. These are all different ways in which that kind of essence of a foundation can be used and adapted and applied in a range of different ways. And the second factor is really to recognize the fact that the power of frames come through their repetition. So even the best frame will fail to work if it isn't used frequently and consistently enough. And so what our research shows is that really foundational relationships is a promising frame, but it needs to be repeated over and again and in a variety of creative and varied ways for it to really stick in public thinking and public discourse. The third recommendation is to show adults participating and benefiting from relationships, not just children. So this is the who do relationships matter to question. So really making clear that healthy relationships early in life affect the well-being of not only the child, but also the adult participant in that relationship. And to foreground the idea that early relational health is a property of that parent-child dyad and not just the child itself. So what we want to do in our communications is to build understanding of the idea that early relationships benefits both parties and not just the child. And why is this strategy needed, or why is it necessary? Well, what we found in our focus groups is that people tend to have a pretty weak understanding of what early relationships mean to adults. They think about them as being one-sided, essentially. So adults being more like the facilitators of relationships rather than full participants in them. So they don't tend to see them as dyadic. They don't tend to see them as reciprocal. And when they do, they tend to assume that parents are the only people with whom those relationships are formed. So what we recommend is to first always feature the adult. So in your messaging around early relational health, make sure that the parent or adult caregiver is clearly visible and prominent in that message. Make it abundantly clear that these relationships exist between and affect and benefit two people, not only the child. You should also make adults active participants in depictions and discussions of relationships. So don't leave people to think that strong relationships just develop organically and spontaneously, but instead show how adults can play a really intentional role in their development and be really specific about how that happens. And the final point is just to make sure that you broaden people's understanding of the kinds of adult participants with whom kids can build nurturing, supportive relationships. So people normally default to parents in their thinking about who relationships are formed with. But of course, a range of different developmental relationships exist with a whole host of different types of adults, including extended family members or childcare providers or members of the broader community. So it's worth featuring those actors wherever you can. The fourth recommendation is to talk about the ways in which relationships and relationship building can be a deeply meaningful and joyful activity for both parents. So as we've already discussed, it's really important to talk about the ways in which early relational health serves as the foundation for later development and outcomes. But it's also important to make the case that early relationships are more than just a means to an end. So that kind of very utilitarian thinking can often lose sight of the ways in which strong relationships are things that people enjoy and they find intrinsically rewarding, and motivating for both children and adults. In fact, in our research, we found that all three groups, so parents and pediatricians and early childcare educators, responded much more productively to messages that acknowledged and validated that immediate joy and pleasure of building relationships with young kids, in addition to those more instrumental benefits. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, the first thing is to really focus on the positive outcomes that accrue when relationships go well. So in addition to focusing on long-term outcomes on health and education and well-being, draw attention to those more immediate proximal outcomes and the pleasure of being deeply connected to other people. The second is to use images and videos to really powerfully demonstrate those positive positive and joyful impacts of relationships for both young children and their caregivers. So really inviting audiences to connect to the issue on that deeper emotional level. And in so doing, building people's will for different types of collective action to support early relational health. And the final question that we need to answer for the public is the question of what needs to happen for relationships to be promoted at a collective level. And the way that we recommend to do this is to show in really specific and concrete ways how we might remodel, reimagine, realign child-facing systems, so pediatrics and early childcare and education and child welfare and family support services, so that relationships are front and center of their work and are prioritized in the way that they need to be. So there are a couple of strands of public thinking in particular that can really get in the way of thinking about relationships as something that can be supported at that broader systemic or collective level. The first is that this idea that what matters for relationships is really just about how much care and concern a parent can show toward their child. So people see caring oftentimes as this intrinsic quality that comes naturally to some and maybe not to others. And as a result, it makes it really hard to appreciate the role of resources and supports in supporting parents and supporting early relational health. And the second is what we call the family bubble, which is a way of thinking that we identify across almost every project we do on early childhood. And this is the idea that the influences upon and the responsibility for a child's development begins and ends with the family. And again, this makes it really challenging for people to appreciate the contexts and environments that can shape parents' capacity to form healthy relationships with children. Okay, so finally, what to do? So to break through this very individualistic way of thinking, advocates should provide really detailed and concrete examples of how systems can incorporate a relational perspective and what outcomes would result. So move them away from thinking about the responsibility falling upon individual parents and families, and instead shifting their focus to systems and contexts. And so what we recommend is a three-step process to tell these more productive stories around systems change. The first is beginning with a description of the status quo. So describing an existing system or existing practice where relationships are not taken seriously or not central to the work. The next step is to really explain how adopting an early relational health perspective would change that system or practice, and being really specific and concrete about the actual change that needs to happen and how that differs from what is currently being done. And the third step in this kind of three-part story is to demonstrate how family outcomes will improve once this early relational health perspective is adopted into existing systems or practice. So connecting those systemic or programmatic changes to specific child and family level outcomes in a way that people can really engage with in a specific way. So now that I've introduced those recommendations, I'll just close out by underscoring just how important it is for us as advocates for early childhood policies and programs to coalesce around a shared framing and messaging strategy. And this is probably no surprise to many of you who are listening, but too often what we find in our work is that advocates in early education or pediatrics or social work or any number of different sectors all function in their own silos and are communicating about young kids using completely different frames and framing strategies. And what happens is that the public are hearing a million different things and don't know what to think. And more often than not, it doesn't do much to meaningfully affect the public discourse. And so instead, it's really critical that members of the field get behind a common strategy. And when you do this, you dramatically increase the opportunities to amplify your message and ultimately create the conditions for systemic change in early childhood services and programming. So I know this is brief, and I know there's probably a lot more to say, and maybe Maura and I can get to it in the Q&A portion. But thank you to everyone who's listening for attention. David, back to you.
That's great. Share my screen. Let's go here. And then here. That was spectacular, and I'm just really thankful for the clarity, and I hope that the framing, messaging, and recommendations are as powerful to you all as they have been to us in our thinking. I've asked for 3 of our colleagues across our fields to reflect on some of their thoughts similarly about the meaning of this report and its findings from their perspective. So first, we have Dipesh Navsaria. He's Vice Chair of Board of Directors of Reach on a Read. He's a pediatrician. He's worked in the public interest for a long time. He's a professor of pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, Public Health, and he's deeply engaged in this kind of relational health thinking work. So Dipesh, can I turn to you?
Great. Thank you very much, David and Maura and Dan. Thank you so much. This is really wonderful work. Speaking as a primary care pediatrician, I've spent many years in primary care working in a variety of settings with a variety of different populations. I'm just delighted to see frames that are turning their attention solidly to early relational health. One of the things that we've known for a long time in primary care pediatrics is that we have very powerful moments with families with a lot of trust and respect on average that families do give us, but those are very short periods of time. So we need to figure out, as we are working with families, what is the most efficient way for us to connect with them and to make sure they're walking out with the right message that we want, right? So it's very easy to inadvertently misstep because you're moving quickly, and to make a family feel like, well, if I don't do Y or Z, then I'm not a good enough parent, right? Or they kept on talking about young children. Well, that doesn't apply to my infant or my toddler. It's going to be when I can have a meaningful conversation with my child, which is much older, right? There's a lot of traps that we can fall into. So the importance of this framing work is that it lets us convey efficiently and effectively messages to parents starting from the earliest days without falling into the traps of parents misinterpreting what we mean or internalizing messages that we never intended for them to feel. One of the things I'm heavily involved with is a program called Reach Out and Read, in which we do talk about early literacy and shared book reading. And we use the checkup as a moment to have that conversation with families. People think we're a book giveaway program, but as I'm fond of saying, we're actually secretly a parenting support program. And the goal is not just about the reading and the book sharing, but it's to help give parents a route to be able to make some of these connections. So a lot of the elements that you heard about nurturing, about caring, about involving adults, right? Because this isn't simply a framing trap we fall into, is parents thinking, oh, you're saying I should read with my child. Yeah, here, I'll just give my child a book. Okay, no, it's not just the book on its own. The book does its magic when it's open in the hands of a caring, nurturing adult and the child in front of them, and they're looking at the book together, that the parent is the important part of the equation. And of course, as was emphasized, how much it means for a parent to be able to enjoy having this moment with their child, recognizing that sometimes a squirmy child may not be interested at that moment. That doesn't represent a failure on the parent's part. I'm fully aware that when I do some of the advocacy work that I do, that I've learned over the years to do exactly one thing that was in the report, which is to specify what I mean when I say young children. I say young child, and I realize that the person I'm speaking to may be thinking about an 8-year-old, Well, from a developmental perspective, as many of we know, an 8-year-old is, whoa, way far down the line, compared to when we might be thinking of an 8-week-old, or an 8-month-old or things like that. So we need to be very concrete in those things when we're talking to media, when we're talking to families, when we're talking to policymakers and others, so that they are aware of exactly what we mean. And I think it's really important to follow another one of the elements that was mentioned, and to try to make sure this isn't turning into a conversation about quote unquote deficient parents. That is such a major trap that people may hear what you're saying and say, yes, yes, I agree with you on all of these things. And in their head, they're thinking, and if only parents loved their children appropriately, they would do all these things, right? And not recognize the important and intrinsic value of being modeled and coached on that, irrespective of your own background, your own education, your own resources, and so on. As I'm often fond of saying, we all like to be told that we're doing a good job as parents. I'm a pediatrician. I allegedly know what I'm doing, and I frequently tell people that, as my teenage children would tell me, I get it wrong all the time. So I think it's really important that we recognize all those things, and then also come to this with the humility that we don't necessarily know what a family's home is like, what their background is like, what their values are like, and what their culture is like. We can only be afforded glimpses into that as they allow us. So I think coming with that sort of respect and saying, what is it that we can learn from them is really important. I'll close with one of the most important things that I ever learned along the way, and I think it has a lot of implications for this kind of work. In every encounter we have with a family, there's 2 questions being asked, whether they're verbalized or not. How is my child doing? And how am I doing as a parent or caregiver? And if we don't address that in some way carefully without making significant missteps, then something's missing from that encounter. So again, thank you for this an excellent work. I think it's going to give us a lot to work on in the field of primary care pediatrics, as well as in the world of Reach Out and Read, and to my many friends in home visiting, early childhood, and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Depesh. I really appreciate your perspective and your thoughts. Let's turn now to Deborah Weatherston, who is will give us an infant mental health perspective. Deborah is currently a consultant in infant mental health in Michigan. She helped co-develop and directed the graduate certificate in infant mental health at Wayne State University, and the founding director of the Alliance for the Advancement of Infant Mental Health. So Deborah, can I turn to you, please? Your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I feel very much, after reading the framework's report and speaking with David many times, that infant mental health is a thought partner with early relational health and frameworks. So I'll present what my thoughts are definitely from an infant mental health perspective, knowing that others have contributed to the thinking of the phrase early relational health. And I turn to Selma Freiberg, who over 40 years ago made her commitment to the centrality of the early developing parent-infant relationship and to the emotional security and connection embedded in it that's reflected in these elegant words. The child learns to love through his first human partners, his parents. We can look upon this miraculous occurrence as a gift of love to the baby. We should regard it as a right, a birthright for every baby and every parent. This, to me, was a love letter to parents and their babies, and it's guided principles and practices for the infant mental health community for many, many years. Some of those beliefs you will see embedded in the language of the framework's report and embedded in what David Willis and his colleagues have developed. That optimal growth and development occurs within emotionally secure and stable relationships that are co-created between parent and infant. That's very important to the infant mental health community. Healthy pregnancy, the birth and care of a baby offer new possibilities for joyful connections, relationship pleasures, growth, and change. We know that the events in the first years of life are significant to health and well-being and affect development over the lifetime. So to the extent that we can promote and support and understand and celebrate these early developing parent-infant relationships, will better assure the gift of love for every baby and every family and every caregiver. But I must add that when stress is understood by both the parent and practitioner, the supportive presence of another is the instrument for healing, hope, and change. So we do support strengths and celebrate, but we also acknowledge when things are difficult and want to offer an empathic response. These beliefs are really foundational to infant mental health and to early relational health and this report. What's exciting is Freiberg wrote a long time ago, the knowledge we have about early development and relationships is a vast scientific treasure that really needs to be returned to babies and their families as a gift from science. I think this effort is moving us along in a pretty terrific way. So what do some actions look like? Well, if we want to be with, next to the parent and baby together. We want to celebrate what's going well. If we can't be with the parent and child together, we want to hold that parent in mind if we're taking care of the child. But when possible, work with the parent and infant together. Invite the parent to talk about the baby, what they love, what they enjoy, and then listen, really listen carefully, making room for parental worries or concerns. The reframing by frameworks is a call to join hands, all of us, around our shared commitments. Concretely, celebrate those first steps, those milestones for babies. Encourage the adolescent parent to play and enjoy her baby, but at the same time listen to the worries, the uncertainties she might hold when she's caring for a child. Listen to the parent whose baby's in an ICU. Invite a father to be part of a home visit. There are so many ways that we can actively engage relationships. All of these ideas and principles are pretty clearly integrated into the service continuum, promotion, prevention, intervention, and treatment that I think was mentioned in the report. In terms of services, early relational health focuses on relationship-centered promotion and prevention and early intervention. While I must say infant mental health practices sometimes focus more particularly at this point in time on relationship-centered preventive intervention and treatment. It's really hard to absolutely separate the two. There's so much overlap. So can we really distinguish? People often ask me that. I wonder. The nurturing of parents, mothers, fathers, other caregiving figures, and babies together is a priority for both infant mental health and early relational health. The strengthening and understanding of early developing and reciprocal relationships is a priority for both. Holding the parent and infant in mind as we observe, listen, educate, support, and strengthen is a priority. Being fully present, being emotionally available, and practicing reflectively are concepts embedded in the report and in early relational health and in infant mental health. To the extent that we, each one of us, can support and sustain warm, nurturing relationships right from the get-go, or offer a relationship to those babies and toddlers in our care, we're going to affect the course of development for generations to come. For me, I just celebrate what you are trying to do And I hope that together we can move forward with some of the new language that Frameworks has offered as a guide. Thanks.
Deborah, thanks so much. I appreciate the comment about it's a call. The Frameworks report is a call to join arms, join hands together in this kind of agenda moving and building. And so thank you for your comments. And let's turn to Bryn Fortune, a colleague within our early relational health national team, as well as within the home visiting community. She's a parent, family and parent leadership director within the Early Childhood Investment Corporation of Michigan. She's raised 2 daughters with special needs, serves in multiple leadership roles in community, state, and national initiatives, and 30 years professional experience in working in systems and parent leadership and parent network development. So, Bryn, your thoughts and reactions to the report and its meaning?
Yeah, I'm so pleased to really have the opportunity to really share some thoughts from the family perspective of why I think early relational health and this framework is such an opportunity for us to truly move the work forward in a way that we all can get to what we all desire, which is better outcomes for all families with an equity lens. And so I want to really circle back to something that was spoken before, in that in the work that each of us does in relationship to families, how we model what we do, how we model our approach to building the relationship to the families we're serving is such an opportunity for us to really learn together, that hand in hand, have that humility that will really allow us to come into these relationships that we're all teachers and we're all learners, and how much the transfer of that will then have an impact on, are we actually approaching our work where many of us, we are skilled in how to build rapport. In how we approach our work, are we transferring that skill for the family to see how to do that for themselves? So for me, what I love about this body of work and why I'm so excited about its possibility and its potential is because it really calls all of us to really drop down into how are we doing our work. We've all spent years developing our expertise on what we're going to do. What is the piece of the pie that we're focused on? But how are we approaching that? And are we really, in the way we're doing our work, forming this solid foundation of relationship? I want to just share, because I really want to illustrate, because this to me is what is going to be so exciting from the parent perspective about this body of work. Over the years, I turned my career into really developing systems for the development of parent leadership inside the state of Michigan. And so I have the great privilege to work with 25 families who are receiving home visiting services. So they have babies and toddlers. When COVID hit the state of Michigan, in that first 10 days, I had an opportunity to really gather via Zoom, as we all are, in our case, it was a conference call, to really learn what is happening with these families that I work with. And I'm not a home visitor. I actually work with them on the dimension of the leadership development part of how that feeds their desire to be really strong leaders in their own families. And it was really illuminating how much they taught me, because we were in this time frame where our field of home visitors was really quickly trying to discover how to adjust their practice. But in that window of time, what I learned from the families was that some of them, in fact, were being challenged. They didn't have their own transportation, and their local grocery store didn't have formula for their babies. But it was through their relationships with their neighbors, through the relationships for those people closest to them in their community, that there were some individuals who did have a car, and they drove up to an hour away to access formula for their baby. So it was a profound story of the very natural informal supports, the natural assets that sit in our communities that we often don't have a lens for in the way we're doing our work. And so I say it to you because it's not a replacement for all the valuable things that we as early childhood professionals are bringing as possibilities to families, but it is to allow us to see, in this case, where are our blinders about where these very natural assets are for a family, and are we really thinking through? For me, it was a big cause of pause to my own work. When I think about the families I'm working with, have I really put enough focus on what indeed is probably in a time of crisis the most critical structure for their own resilience inside this crisis? Of have I really focused on helping strengthen and build forward what are very natural support systems for them? Or am I so focused on my piece of the pie that I've lost the greater view that families are sitting inside natural assets? And how am I helping to strengthen the building of that? So I just think it really causes us to pause in this listen to learn. How can we really learn from the families we're serving that it's so much bigger than the piece of the pie that we're working in? And how can we really begin to form relationships that bring that to life? And that to me is the excitement about this body of work. I think it challenges all of us to think about how we're doing our work. I think it challenges us to really look at how are we practicing what we do? How are we building the relationships? How are we seeing this person as a whole person, this family as a whole family, knowing that what we do brings about the possibility of a different future for people because of how we do our work. So I really want to close saying that I have a strong enthusiasm for what I think are the possibilities, because I think it really calls us all to think about things in a new way. And yet, even in the example I gave, I can tell you that for me, I'll borrow a term from Strengthening Families. It is only a small but very significant change that I will make in how I do my work with the families. And I think that's key to this, that there are many small but significant changes we can all do by looking at this foundational relationship lens and how are we working in it ourselves. So I'll close with that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bryn, for bringing this to keeping the family voice, family experience, and family wisdom front and center. I know we're coming towards the end of our time. I want to touch on perhaps just two questions before I close. One is in the chat. There was a question, I think this from Rob Jones, that could go to the frameworks team. What is the effect of culture or various cultural norms on this kind of framing? How do we think about that?
So I'll take that. I'm sorry, I have a,
Okay.
sorry, no, there's a kid in the background. Culture is immensely important when we're thinking about framing. That's why we do spend a lot of time really paying attention to sort of shared cultural models, mental models of how people are thinking of early childhood. So that tendency of aging up, the black box, that we were talking about, because we then design framing strategies knowing that those models are shaping people's thinking about an issue. There are also, we didn't talk about this, there are models that we want to, that can be incredibly productive for our messaging, that we want to sort of build up in our messaging. So culture is everything. Frameworks is what we would say.
Great. And again, in the interest of time, we will go through some of the questions that are in the chat. And over the next week, we will post some of the answers to the questions that were given to us so that you can see them. I do want to say that the report was released today and posted on both Frameworks website as well as the CSSP website. You can see the full report, all these specific details and the like. It's beautifully done, and we're really thrilled with that effort. I just want to foreshadow what's moving forward from this effort. and that is we are going to continue from the CSSP frame with the support of Perigee and others in the expanding this work towards advancing this early relational health work and these foundational relationships understandings within child health transformation and early childhood system building. We will continue to expand CSSP as a national coordinating hub of this effort, not only with our early relational health advisory team who help us with guide and advising the field's progress, accelerating activities and champions and other networks, but also to help develop a key set of practice and system strategies that promote activities that support these foundational relationships. We'll also be partnering over these next period with networks to advance early relational health, specifically with Reach Out and Read, but also with some of our early childhood our CSSPs, early childhood link communities. And we're really looking at how do we broaden the next generation of leadership, not only within our capacities of CSSP itself, but also beyond with others around advancing relational health leadership in terms of moving this perspective, this frame, this understanding into broadening the field. I really want to thank everyone's participation today. We're thankful of you all being here. It is, as Deborah said, important to join hands in terms of this kind of messaging. The importance of those 4 major take-homes, which was when we're talking about early relational health and foundational relationships, we must talk about early as early. We must focus on using the term foundational relationships. We want to really acknowledge the benefit of the relational context for both members of the relationship itself, and also the meaningfulness and the powerfulness and the importance of the moment in the relational experience. And we can't underemphasize the amazing importance of the relational context now in face of stress, challenges, and difficulties in our communities. And as Bryn called out, yet the power of relationships that surround neighborhoods, families, and friends have a protective effect, if not bringing hope and possibility moving forward. So again, thank you to all for attending. Thank you to the discussants. Thanks to Frameworks, and we wish you all well and continue on this journey. Thanks so much.